Good afternoon. My name is Allison Stanger. I'm a senior fellow at the Hannah Arendt Center, and I am keenly aware that the three of us stand between you and wine and cheese. So we very much want to make this worth your while, and I'm happy to report that it shouldn't be too difficult because of the brilliant women we have sitting to my left here. I wanted to start, since Roger said that this was going to be a closing panel about poetry, I just wanted to start by reading you the title that Roger wrote of this panel, which is Technology, Pluralism, and Cosmopolitanism Amidst the Future of Tribalism. Okay, so no mention of poetry whatsoever, but we do have two wonderful poets, so I can't help but think it's going to seep into the water. So here's what the format's going to be. I'm just the moderator, and we'll have Zoë Hitzig. She is seated to your right, speak first, and then Anne Lauterbach. They're both incredible. Zoë is my co-director of the Getting Plurality Research Network at Harvard University. She is a member of the Harvard Society of Fellows, which if you don't know what that is, it's like you have to be the smartest person in the world to get in. She has a PhD in mathematical economics, undergraduate degree in mathematics, and has already published 2 volumes of poetry, including poems in the New York Review of Books and the New Yorker. So she's a pretty amazing person. She may reveal to you a bit more about things she knows about as well. And of course, what can we say? We have Anne Lauterbach. She is one of Bard's and the world's finest poets. I heard several people say last night that Anne always gives the best talk at the Hannah Arendt conferences, even though she's nervous before giving it. So I know she will not let us down. And so without further ado, I'd like to welcome Anne Lauterbach to this podium. Oh, excuse me. That's right. We don't want Zoë to follow Anne, so Zoë will go first.
Yes, thank you, Allison, and thanks everyone for making this conference so great so far. And yes, I'm really just here, so I'm going to give some brief remarks about digital technology and pluralism, hitting on some of the words in the title of the panel, but really just trying to get out of the way so we can hear from Anne, and it's a real honor to be on a panel with her. She's someone who I've really looked up to for a long time. So my thesis, if there is one in these remarks, is simple. It's that communication, which is an important element of any kind of plural society, requires sharing both content and context. And while digital information technologies have dramatically advanced the speed and scale of our ability to share content across vast differences, they have not kept pace in conveying context. Digital technology can play a valuable role in wiring us together in a pluralistic society, but its ability to do so relies on a healthy ratio of content to context, a balance which we do not currently have. So I'm going to start with an extremely naive, sort of elemental question, and sort of an abstract one, more abstract than this conference has been so far, which is, how do we communicate with each other? One simple way of answering that question is that communication involves a combination of verbal and nonverbal language that carries the content, the what of a message. We interpret this content through context, the who, when, how, why, and where. Context binds content to meaning. Think about how this works in face-to-face communication. what we're all doing here. Think about some specific communicative act that took place over the last few days. Some small talk by the coffee dispenser, a particularly insightful and well-calibrated question in one of the sessions, or maybe just someone's awkward smile as they emerged from one of the genderless bathroom stalls. Whatever it was, the mere fact that the interaction took place in person likely supplied a common understanding of some basic context. Your answers to some basic questions would likely coincide with the other parties in the exchange. Where? Olin Hall. When? Mid-October. Who? Well, at least you know it's the kind of person who comes to the Arendt Center's annual conference. What's kind of amazing about in-person interaction, and really should not be overlooked or taken for granted, is how much common understanding of context face-to-face interaction affords us. Our interpretations are rich and nuanced for all the available sensory details, and our keen faculties for picking up on contextual cues honed over millennia of social, biological, and cultural evolution. But we also know that face-to-face interaction is limited in its pluralistic potential. It's limited by physics, by the space-time continuum, by gravity and other pesky realities which make it hard, if not impossible, to be in two places at one time. There are the vast oceans that carve us onto our continents, not to mention our anatomical circumscription into a single body, and the way that family, work, and limited resources bound us often to a tight radius around our dwellings. If we could only talk to those we were near to in space and time, we would not be able to communicate with very many people, not very often at all. Our possibilities for pluralism would, of course, be accordingly limited. Communication technologies change that. Communication technologies allow content to travel across distance and time. Think of cuneiform tablets, the printing press, the telegraph, the telephone, the radio, then emails and internet forums, text messages, and social media. Each of these technologies broadened the possibilities for communication, but mostly by making it easier to shoot the content of a message into some future time and place, a catapulting of content that is made possible only through a compression of context. Each major advance in communication technology alters our ability to move content by changing how context is conveyed, or distorted, or flattened, or omitted. In response to each development in communication technology, we try to develop new norms and expectations and tools to reassert context where it has been lost, preserving our ability to extract the intended meaning from some communication. Ancient cuneiform tablets bore a seal impression rolled into the wet clay, serving as a signature, indicating that a particular individual or institution authored and authorized the contents of the tablet. Ever since books have been printed, they have included a colophon, detailing facts about the book's production, the publisher, the date, the city, the press, and so forth. Since the early 13th century, paper makers have embedded watermarks in their paper to signal facts about the quality of the paper or the intended origin and destination of the missive written upon it. Telegrams were, of course, stamped with information about the originating office and the date on which they were sent. We heard a bit from Lindsay and Jana yesterday about Arendt's views on mass communication. As mass media emerged, Arendt observed both the promises and perils of these technologies, noting how it could foster connectedness, but also homogenization, isolation, and propaganda. Another way of putting it is that mass media accelerated the speed and reach of content delivery, while efforts to maintain context lagged far behind. In other words, our attempts to reassert context in communication often struggle to keep pace with context-compressing technologies. I think of the admittedly overblown story of Orson Welles' radio adaptation of War of the Worlds, which we all know was formatted as real-time news bulletins, and some listeners, though it may have only been a few, believed a Martian invasion was genuinely occurring. This incident underscored the need to establish context in mediums that carry both fact and fiction. Following the event, radio hosts became more diligent in providing context, frequently inserting disclaimers when content was fictional, rebroadcast, or sponsored. On today's internet, the idea that we might expect a disclaimer to help understand the context of some piece of information, an advertisement, a post on social media, an email that looks spammy but could plausibly come from a family member. This idea sounds quaint. The internet's attempts to reassert context are absolutely no match for the turbocharged speed and scale of content delivery. It's hard for two people to agree on any basic facts of the context of a message. Consider the attempts at fact-checking on Twitter, now known as X, an infernal platform, to use Sebastian's word, with 500 million active users run by a billionaire sociopath, which sporadically attaches a community note, which users of the platform use to provide context to otherwise compressed 280-character messages. Researchers who talk about the social impacts of digital technology often highlight concerns like privacy violations or data protection or misinformation, disinformation, and deception. I believe all of these issues can be unified under the umbrella of context. Effective communication, the kind of communication needed for a pluralistic society, requires participants to be able to identify and protect the context of their exchanges. So what do I really mean by identify context? Well, I mean, to be able to identify context is to understand and authenticate the who, why, where, how, when of a communication. Who posted this tweet? Who sent me this email or photo or text message? When was it written? Why? Is it from a person or an organization? Is the organization a nonprofit, a for-profit, a government? Do they have my interests in mind? Was it generated by a human or by an algorithm? Am I seeing it because it is relevant to me or because I am easy to manipulate? To be able to protect context is to have confidence that the communication will not be shared or misused outside of the intended who, why, where, how, when of the communication. Can I trust that this private email I would like to send will not be published in a newspaper, or read in court, or read by my employer, or my spouse, or my child? Will this go viral? Is the mediator of this communication channel, the platform, the telecom company, going to use my message to train a generative model that captures my likeness, that threatens to replace me, that will lead me blindly into purchasing a new pair of shoes I don't need or wouldn't want without the endowment of this alien motivation? Would it lead me to attack someone I don't know or attack the Capitol? Many problems in digital communication, to summarize what I'm saying here, often labeled by a swirl of terms that sort of gesture toward authenticity or truth, and also privacy and data protection, are fundamentally about context. Without an ability to authenticate context, we can't establish norms for protecting it. Without protection, authentication efforts may be futile. What I'm saying here is that authenticity and privacy are two sides of the same coin, and treating them as separate issues hinders our ability to see possible solutions to our inability to communicate across difference. The problem is not that we can shoot enormous amounts of and types of content across the globe to anyone with an internet connection, but that this ability to share content has not been accompanied by methods for preserving and asserting context. I don't want to pretend that I have solutions. The deep problem that I cannot solve here and that we must not ever sugarcoat is that the direction of innovation is currently determined by what's good for capital and not by what's good for people. And that will continue to be true as long as we continue bowing at the feet of our big tech overlords. But I do think that this perspective about context shows us a few things that could be useful in building toward more pluralistic communication through an ability to speak to each other online. I would break these into tools for identifying context and tools for protecting context. I'll just give a few examples and then we can talk more in the discussion. In terms of identifying context, I think about new forms of digital identity authentication that leverage state-of-the-art technologies like zero-knowledge proofs to allow you to authenticate with different traits in different contexts. These are sometimes called anonymous credentials by cryptographers. You could have a credential to prove you're a person, to prove your age, to prove various facts about you, and that give you control over your desired balance of anonymity and knowability. One example, or one set of examples of tools for protecting context are communication channels that are run by organizations that are nonprofits, that have your interests in mind, like Signal or other messaging apps. And one other simple technique is to use disappearing messages to not allow yourself to be rendered into data, to invest in what is not machine legible, the aspects of human experience that defy easy codification, resist reduction to mere information, and refuse to be absorbed into disembodied systems of surveillance and control. In the age of the internet, all that I've said perhaps has been a bit repetitive. In the age of the internet, pluralism requires that our methods for identifying and protecting with whom, when, and how we communicate must keep pace with the ever-accelerating speed of what we are sharing.
Make it different. Then, of course, there's no place to put this water, which I'll probably need. Okay, the first thing you have to do is forget all the things, nice things that were said about Anne Lauterbach in the beginning of this panel. Please, just erase. Context be damned. Thank you, Zoe. That was really remarkable and wonderfully informed. My talk, Technology, Pluralism, and Cosmopolitanism Amidst the Return of Tribal, a Poet's Discontinuous Meditation. Ever since I watched Ray Kurzweil here at Bard's Fisher Center draw on a huge projected screen, two lines rapidly ascending to convergence in what he called the singularity, I have felt a mix of melancholy gladness and anxious fear. gladness that I will probably not be alive when this event occurs, and fear that it will, like death, inevitably occur. Is there a big echo here? Since then, my dark thought is that our species has decided to will itself extinct, that we have tired of the difficulty of living, of the human condition, used up our resources, and now we are ready to abandon life on a technological arrow released from Elon Musk's bow. This thought is like a shadow that follows at my side, even as I delight and wonder at the shifting sky, the turning leaves, the quizzical expression on the face of a perplexed student. Of the three of us on this panel, I am the card-carrying Luddite. Not that I don't have the necessary mind extensions at my fingertips, I do, and am grateful for their alacrity, their aid to my poor spelling and habitual lack of factual retention, not to mention the more or less constant multiple correspondences which no longer need forever stamps. But I am not on social media, do not have a website, and in general, my technological prowess is about 2%, like the milk in my coffee. So I am about 98% Luddite. The Luddites, you will recall, were textile workers in England in the 19th century who opposed the development of machines to do their work. This posture might seem suitable for a poet, aligned with the general public's consensus that poetry is useless, atavistic, and anachronistic. At least my kind of poetry, teased out of the linguistic archive in my soul, which in turn is constantly fed by the changing linguistic stream from the world. Where this puts me on the sliding, slippery, tribal, cosmopolitan scale is anyone's guess. A tribe, say, of childless cat lady poets raised in 20th century Manhattan who prefers hybridity, pivots, and plurals to dichotomies, binaries, and dualities. I could teach a master class in ambiguity, indecision, uncertainty, and doubt. Can machines doubt? Hannah Arendt describes the advent of doubt in the human condition with Galileo and Copernicus and the making of the telescope. She wrote, "The old opposition of sensual and rational truth, of the inferior truth capacity of the senses and the superior truth capacity of reason paled beside this challenge, that neither truth nor reality is a given, that neither of them appears as it is, and that only interference with appearance, doing away with appearances, can hold out a hope for true knowledge." How do we do away with appearances now that almost everything comes to us as an appearance, an apparition? Our current crisis in the humanities stems, I think, from our overvaluation of a specific kind of cognitive intelligence. She's so smart. And our near contempt for emotional intelligence, the array of responses and insights traditionally informed by the arts, paintings, musics, fictions, poems, the learning of other languages. Persons from every conceivable social and cultural background make things. It is a primary human activity. Arendt's homo faber, which she defined as the sheer unending variety of things whose sum total constitutes the human artifice. This week's issue of Hyperallergic has a story about indigenous storytelling through culinary arts. I was reminded I was reminded of the old meaning of tribal, the sense of a shared set of inherited customs and beliefs, gatherings in neighborhoods, familiars and families, which was so eloquently addressed on yesterday's panel and today, just earlier. Technology has altered this idea of the tribal, even as it has imitated or manufactured a sense of belonging in a system of silos, brandings, slogans, podcasts, and platforms, replacing or displacing many of the artifacts and activities of shared experiences in real time and place. Allison suggested I watch Spike Jonze's 2013 film, Her, if I wanted to get up to speed about technology. I watched it a few nights ago. An overdetermined, as we used to say, and attenuated fantasy about a romance between a guy, last name Twombly, who falls in love with what is referred to in the film as an OS, for operating system, named Samantha. At a certain moment, Samantha sends a real woman to have real sex with Twombly, but it doesn't work. He can't quite manage the gap between Samantha's disembodied voice in his ear and the actual stranger's body in his bed. The film seems to be about displaced narcissism and misplaced intimacy, two signal chronic symptoms of our techno world. Among the losses we are experiencing is the nexus of capacities that depend on speaking to each other in person, which is how Zoë began her wonderful talk. That is, in our actual bodies, where gestures of our hands, eyes, mouths, tones of voice contribute to our ability to interpret and comprehend. Our bodies are porous, if fallible instruments with multiple pathways of reception and response, dispositions of belief and faith, love and hope, trust and care, doubt and curiosity are dependent on vocabularies of affective gesture and relation. Without these, we move in a world of transactions in which we make love to operating systems and forget how to make artifacts that give us delight, and eventually trace their origins to distant hands. I'll just stop here and for a moment to recommend to all of you to see this Sienna show at the Met. If you can get in, it is astonishing and does exactly this, gives you a kind of intimacy with very distant hands indeed. It's really a wonderful exhibition. I'm reminded of the American philosopher William James' definition of experience. My experience is what I agree to attend to, he wrote. My experience is what I agree to attend to. Only those items which I notice shape my mind without selective interest. Experience is an utter chaos. Interest alone gives accent and emphasis, light and shade, background and foreground, intelligible perspective. It varies in every creature, but without it, the consciousness of every creature would be a gray, chronic indiscriminateness, impossible for us even to conceive. But we did conceive it, this gray, chaotic indiscriminateness, only we made it appear to be an experience. Attending to something and thus not to something else implies that there is always a something else over there in the other room, across the street, in another country. Technology has made this elsewhere into a mayhem of simultaneous attentions, an incessant appearing cascade with so many entangled narratives and images that we become bewildered and estranged. This is not cosmopolitan, this disparate array. It comes at us on cool, flat, glassy plains, time without space, in which our bodies necessarily lose their bearings and begin to feel like leftover, inconvenient encumbrances. It might all come down to pronouns after all. What if all of us, the multitude of eyes, were to become they? Then what? The self is plural. This is not what Arendt intended by her vision, but it might help us to escape the carapace that seems to be forming around our ability to know another by other than their overt identity. We come into the world with few means of communicating, and gradually these expand. We begin to attach words to objects, to persons, and to things. And this newfound attachment causes gleeful wonder. Wonder, Arendt reminds us, was the beginning of philosophy, of thought. The astonishment that the word, sound, bird refers to that creature outside on a twig making its own wordless sound. We begin with no words, then we have words, and they come from a multitude of sources, different for each of us. The self is made from a constellation of vocabularies, drawn from myriad experiences, attentions, persons, places, and things. We cannot be reduced to a single epithet, Gen Z, Black, Jewish. The self is plural, hybrid, and mutable. Let's imagine that our psyches are more like the weather than the tree being thrashed around in a storm. We are not an operating system, a bot. We can change our minds and open our hearts. The tribe we belong to is human. Thank you.
She did it again. I neglected to mention that what's going to happen now is that I will just give a few brief questions to each of our speakers, and then we'll turn it over to you. And I'll try to make this really brief because I know you want to interact with them. So first, Zoe. And I think they did an amazing job. I mean, we'll be carrying on this conversation afterwards, but Zoe, I love I love the whole driving force of this talk a lot. This idea that today's internet is turbocharging content delivery and we're losing context. And I think context is and you would agree, is such an important part of meaning, and also emphasize this point. So I'm wondering how to put this question. In what sense can we arrest these negative impacts of massive digitalization on the human? You know, you mentioned some interventions that I think were important, and I guess maybe one of the things I could do is just ask you to riff on those a little bit. When you talked about tools for reviving context, maybe you could explain a little bit about personhood and zero-knowledge proofs, because who knows what a zero-knowledge proof is out there? Okay. It's actually good. It's a very cool concept. So maybe you could talk a little bit about that. I also wonder what you would think of the following proposition, which is that bots and algorithms don't have rights, humans do. In other words, our laws should privilege the human tribe, as Anne so nicely summarized it. To what extent can that help us uphold the human? And finally, third question would be to ask you perhaps to say a bit about these various quests for a public internet, a non-commercial space. There are a number of them out here now, and they're super fascinating to think about, and I myself am quite interested in these initiatives. I just wonder what promise you see with that option for restoring the human, keeping humans first. and machines augmenting human intelligence rather than superseding it? And you could take up any of these questions as well, Anne, but those are specifically for Zoe. And then for Anne, should we do it that way? Should we let each, would you prefer that? Okay.
Okay.
Zoe, go for it.
Is this on? Yeah. Okay. Thank you, Allison. Thank you, Anne. Those are all such great questions. I don't know where to start. I think one place that I'll start that I think goes to your first question about, what are the hopeful visions of preserving the human in this, swirl of mass communication, or how Anne put it, the elsewhere of simultaneous attention, which I loved. I'll say that I was torn in giving this talk between what I think of as like my more sort of dismal poet side that wants to say the answer is to retreat, to go home, take yourself off the internet, throw your devices far away. And I think really sort of be forgotten. There's a movement and that has come along with some successful laws now and in the EU and in California about enforcing a right to be forgotten in digital platforms. And I think that, that has a kind of technical meaning, but also it's sort of a fuzzy idea that they're struggling to enforce. But I love the idea of it, which is what can we do to walk away, be forgotten, be illegible, find the regions of your experience that cannot be translated into data, that cannot be knowable in some way, because once you become knowable, you lose the mystery of being alive and connecting with people. So that's my first answer, which is, the dismal poet side, or maybe it's not dismal, maybe it's just a bit romantic. A more pragmatic side of me wants to give something for people to believe in, and people who, not just people to believe in, but people who are more pragmatically minded. The people who work in technology who want to solve problems. If you give them the speech that I just gave about being unknowable and resisting datafication, they're just gonna look at you like you have 6 heads. They're like, I don't know what to do with that. I don't know what you're saying. So, what's an alternative? Well, let's see if we can come up with some initiatives for them to work on, some things that they can channel their energy into because they see the problems of society and they see the problems as problems that they can try to use technology to solve. Which, I touched very quickly at the end of my talk on a few promising technologies that I see in the cryptography world, one of which is this idea of anonymous credentials, which is essentially an idea that says, whenever you want to prove who you are, let's say you're trying to prove that you are who you say you are on social media, you often have to fork over a huge amount of information. It's way overkill. You end up sending, I think on Instagram right now, you have to send in your driver's license. And that's giving way too much information to a platform that doesn't have your best interests in mind. When really all Instagram really needs to know is that you're a person. And so anonymous credentials essentially enable this. They're a kind of credential that allows you to prove a very limited claim about yourself. For example, you might just want to prove I am a person. And so you can have this credential that you walk around the internet with, and you could use it to, instead of passing CAPTCHAs, instead of having to solve those stupid puzzles all the time, you can just have this credential that says, I'm a person. And now I don't have to tell you anything more about myself, and I don't have to solve all these CAPTCHAs. How do you get that? We have to build a good system. Yeah. Yeah. But I've written a bit about how the system could work. I have recently published a paper a few months ago about various ways that we could set up this system so that also the issuer of the system doesn't have too much control or power over all of this. So that's one sort of promising technology that I think is useful, but you might want to prove not just that you're a person, but that you're over 18, or that in Estonia they have a amazing digital identity program that is like super privacy preserving and not Big Brother scary, which they use to allow people to vote anonymously, which is, I think, a thrilling idea, to be able to vote anonymously online. It's kind of, it like really is hard to imagine in this country, but the possibilities for online democracy would really open up if people had this sort of way of proving some verified claims about themselves in a private way. I think, I don't want to keep talking, but Allison did have more questions for me. Maybe we can circle back to the other ones later in the conversation.
That sounds good. Anne gave us so much to think about as well, and I guess I have kind of two clusters of questions. I'm trying to crystallize them right now. I think the first one has to do with the crisis in the humanities that you mentioned, and what you would see as the likely response to that. This is like an educational question. Do we recenter the humanities? Do you ideologize the humanities? Or do we take kind of a Rousseauian approach and approach education like Rousseau thought was ideal for Emile? Do you remember Emile's ideal education, which is, no humanities till you've had all the STEM stuff first. The humanities is you have to develop your mind before you turn to the humanities. Zoe has the Emile education. I'm just thinking. So that's one. And maybe, go ahead and answer, then I'll ask you another, and then we'll turn it over to the audience.
I don't have an answer to it. But the reason I brought it up is because of the essential point that I wanted to make. Is this on? Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Was that we undervalue affective intelligence hugely, and the internet has increased that because it's made affective intelligence, emotional intelligence, into a kind of cartoon. So that my anxiety about the humanities is simply that it is in keeping with this move toward another idea of what it means to be human and what it means to be smart. So this overemphasis, which is very interesting because Arendt is very aware of it also, I think, early on, that quote she has about doubt and this very curious notion that that even before Descartes, there was this idea that the senses, that our senses were inferior somehow to our mind. And I think that's a huge mistake. And I think it's part of what's divided us from the rest of the country, the rest of the animals and nature. So if we stop being so conceited about our brains and a little bit more aware of the necessity of our sensorium and how it informs our capability of feeling for others, not just for ourselves, then I think anyway, that's why I brought that up. I don't know what the solution is, except for to shift back into at least some kind of balance about what is necessary to become a grown-up. You know, I think all the time at Bard about how people come as freshmen as basically kids. They're just kids who just left home, and then in 4 years are expected to leave and enter the world as, you know, what we call grown-ups. It's an amazing expectation in 4 years for that to happen on every single possible level. And it seems to me that one of the ways to prepare people for being grown-ups in 4 years is definitely the humanities.
I think that's brilliant, and I'm happy to report to you that, as you're probably aware, cognitive science, recent advances in cognitive science have pretty much blown up Cartesian dualism. Our intelligence
It's about time.
Yeah. Our intelligence is embodied.
Right.
Human intelligence is embodied, and the emotions are embodied. You know, you had that wonderful question of, can machines doubt? And I don't think they can. You know, because doubt is an emotion. It's kind of the withering of meaning in some ways, and that's embodied. But here I just want to throw out a kind of thought teaser type question that doesn't really have an answer. It's just asking your view on it. And Zoe, you could feel free to comment too. You know, you mentioned the singularity, and I'm very pleased you watched her. We're going to have a conversation about that afterwards. Maybe if any of you have watched it, we could talk about it in the Q&A. But let me put it this way. Look, what are computers made of? They're made of chemicals and electricity. You know, silicon and electricity. What are humans made of? Well, we're made of electricity and carbon, chemicals. And so as we look at these advances in artificial intelligence, this sort of raises this provocative question. Because we could say that human intelligence is embodied and it's different from machine intelligence. But what if that could be what if human intelligence can be simulated by building something new out of chemicals and electricity, by reverse engineering the human brain? Will that ever really be possible?
I don't know why we'd want to do that.
That's a good response. That's a good response.
I just don't know why we'd want to do that. I don't understand why anybody wants the singularity, which is basically when technology is smarter than humans. That's a goal. I don't know why that's a goal. I don't know what that's going to solve. And I also think it's just such a shame, because that will radically increase our sense that we already have, and the young have it tremendously, this idea that your body, your being, is sort of inefficient and negligible and not anything like as shiny and fast and smart as the machine that you're holding in your hand. I think that's a terrible shame. And it's led to things like this constant desire for your face and your body to resemble some bizarre, perfected creature that maybe present company accepted is impossible. I don't know why we want to do that. Why do we want to do that? I don't know. It's really confusing to me. It makes me feel ridiculous.
I could suggest one possible motivation to you.
Yeah, okay.
Which is these boys want to build, and they say this, chatbots that teenage girls will fall in love with.
Right.
It's the revenge of the nerds.
Well, also, but
they forget that teenage girls like bodies too, right?
Yeah. Somebody wanted to ask a question.
Yeah, we'll go to questions now. Please. Oh, wait, we're going to wait for a mic. I think other people may not be able to hear without a mic, so.
Thank you for this panel, and thank you, Ann Lauterbach, for bringing up sense-based intelligence. I think this question of technology started at the beginning of this conference, and it changes this ostensible antithesis of cosmopolitanism on the one hand and tribalism on the other, because it's not clear how that's working at all. And as just an example, all you have to do is to think of Elon Musk and his desire for, let's say, self-perpetuation. And, you know, he's a technologist. I don't think it's working along the lines politically that people thought it would, and perhaps that's because technology is another example of the anti-political. It is not conducive necessarily to, as again McLuhan talked about politics, as a system of challenge, contest, and negotiation. It just doesn't belong there. So on this level, it doesn't matter one iota what the intentions of the creators, if that's the word. I actually reject this. The people who invent these new technologies, it doesn't matter one iota. It's not about their ability to take on various problems and solve them, et cetera, et cetera. I'm thinking here of actually Hannah Arendt, who took great pains, if I remember correctly, to distinguish between thinking and what she called, quote, mere cognition, unquote. It's very important to remember this distinction, I think. She actually said that she described thinking as something like a bootstrap phenomenon. That's a quotation as well. We don't know how humans ever began to do this thing that we call thinking, and there's no guarantee whatsoever that it will continue into the future. And I think so-called thinking machines and thinking of thinking machines as such are, this idea needs critique. And if I remember correctly, Lindsay Stonebridge brought up the prologue to The Human Condition. And in the prologue, a very short piece of writing, just a few pages long, Arendt says of the men who created the atomic bomb that they didn't understand something very important, that they would be the last people to be consulted as to its usage. And so, yeah, I mean, this panel opens up, again, all kinds of really critical questions, but Hannah Arendt, I think, was prescient, to put it mildly, about technology and technologist, and the conversion of science into technoscience. Thank you.
Do you want to say? I'd like to say something about this, but you're our star, so.
You go first.
Okay, I think you're raising a really valuable point, and Hannah Arendt was prescient, but it's extremely important to actually look at what these tools are doing, because they're absolutely astonishing. Some of the things that these new chatbots are doing, mind-bogglingly so. And I would just point out one thing to ponder. The recent Nobel Prizes in both physics and chemistry went to computer scientists, which a lot of people were upset about because of the disciplinary trespassing. What was most striking to me about that was that the scientists did not come from universities, they came from industry. And that's the reality of 21st century power now. Our government, and I've written about this, has outsourced its brains, and the balance of power between the private and public sector has never before in human history appeared in these proportions. And that's part of the reality that we're dealing with. And I just wanted to throw that on the table as we have these discussions, that these people are moving forward, they're inventing things, and it may take a coordinated effort in this moment of what Finn and O'Toole called feral capitalism to stop them?
I just wanted to say one thing about that, which is just because of my claim for the Luddite position, and the Luddite position is also the position of ignorance. But it seems to me that it's very important not to reject what's happening wholesale as if we could, because we can't. But the point, I think, also is Zoe's point, which is context. Like, is there going to be something that's useful and helpful to the human or not? And those distinctions are not being made. So obviously, medicine, for example, is making these astonishing advances because of this technology. Well, I'm not going to sit here and say they shouldn't do that, right? So it's very important to begin to find a way to begin to make distinctions among and between, which I think is what you're trying to think about, yeah?
Yeah, definitely.
You want to add to that?
No, yeah, I mean, I'll just add very quickly that I think I agree with what Anne and Allison just said, and I would also add that I'm wary of demonizing technology too much, because technology is amazing. Like what it is in its word and in its foundations is something that does make us more human by opening up realms of possibility, which has come up a lot. This idea that we build ourselves in uncertainty, the idea that the future is not fixed, that we could become something different than we are now. And, technology historically has been that, or, at certain points in time has been that. It's been this thing that can make us feel like we're not bounded, like we might become something and evolve into something that makes life worth living, And yeah, as Allison's pointing out, it's not technology that's part of what's so perverse right now is that the technologists in power talk about technology as if it's deterministic, and that there's a specific path that they're bringing us onto that is fixed, and it's theirs, and it is not open to possibility. And that's what's scary. It's that technology has become a perversion of the idea of technology.
It's well said. Yes, in the back.
Hi. Sorry. I have a question for Zoe. Do you think that, well, I suppose I should start. First of all, when we talk about digital communication, we're not just discussing user-to-company interactions, but also user-user interactions, organizations, a variety of third parties with different motives, ideas, histories, etc. When we consider those and privacy in that context, does, I suppose, a system which involves complete user anonymity and privacy reduce our ability to understand and authenticate context? Does it reduce accountability for actions like deception, misinformation, etc.?
That's a great question, and I think that the big struggle, or what I think, or you could view as an opportunity, is to say, what kind of context do I need for a given setting? There's a philosopher of technology and a legal scholar named Helen Nissenbaum, who my talk is very much influenced by, who has a theory of privacy as contextual integrity. She says that an information flow is private if it respects the contextual norms of the interaction. And it takes a little bit of time to sort of unpack that idea and see that it's not just tautological. It's not. It's kind of deep. And I think that when I think about the power of tools for shielding identity or shielding certain aspects of your identity, I see that as powerful because it gives us this control over refining, kind of like picking and choosing which pieces of our identity we want to reveal in a very specific context. That might be that you want to reveal a full version of yourself in certain kinds of communication, in which case you can have a digital driver's license and your full likeness, maybe even like 20,000 photographs of you that you share with your family. We all do that, and that's meaningful in certain contexts. But I see the power of anonymous credentials as really being about being able to tailor the context that you're sharing to the interaction based on your perception of what that interaction requires and what will make that interaction most meaningful or useful, as the case may be. But really, thank you for that question.
It's a good one. Yes, over here. Oh, I'm sorry, you're in my blind spot.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone. I teach at a small university in Pennsylvania, and I heard you talk about the right to be forgotten. I heard you talk about homo faber and the nature of human beings as making animals. And I'm worried a little about what I call a crisis of agency, or what Eve Kosofsky-Sedgwick talked about, the middle ranges of agency. And I wondered if you could contrast the right to be forgotten with the right to create, the right to have agency as a member of the human tribe.
Anne?
The right to agency and the right to creativity as a single, or as in some way in conflict?
I think a lot of my students don't understand why they should make anything, or why their making has any meaning when they can simply go to a chatbot that will do it more precisely than they can. The nature of creative agency as being human.
Oh, it's quite a profound question. And actually, a friend of mine just wrote to me and said, what would you think if nobody ever read anything you wrote? And then he said, well, to put it another way, why do you write? I haven't answered either of these questions. The first one I could answer immediately, because I never think about anybody reading anything I write. I just don't ever think about it. I'm always surprised if somebody has. So that's just a thing. But it seems to me that when you're talking to somebody who, I think the way I could put this maybe most directly to you goes something like this, that for years I thought that Anne was making poems, and then at a certain moment I thought, oh no, the poems made Anne. It reversed itself. And I realized I was the result of this activity, this, what you called agency, and that the result was kind of wonderful for me. I mean, I got very lucky because I came from places where there wasn't a whole lot of hope, and there wasn't a whole lot of endowed agency. I had to sort of make it up as I went along. And I chose this peculiar idea of being a poet because I knew it was completely outside of almost all of the markers for what success looks like in America, right? Which would have to do with money and have to do with families of a very particular kind and so on. The whole liberal agenda. I thought, well, I can go around this a little bit. So that's very particular to being a poet, or maybe even to my time. But I think that one could expand that idea to tell kids, just pick up a brush and begin making something and see if that doesn't give you so much more pleasure and so much more interest in becoming, which is really what you were talking about, Zoe, this idea of change, how do we change is a question I really have about being human. Like, how does change happen? And one of the ways change happens is by making things. I'm almost positive that there's a correlate between being a certain person at a certain time in life and another, and feeling different in another time because you've made something. And it doesn't have to be a work of art. I mean, I'm prejudiced about works of art because they give so much pleasure to others. But I think it could be making anything.
Yes. No, they're coming with the mic.
Oh. She's had her hand
We
up.
want to hear you and where you're from.
Yeah. Hi, I'm Sam. I'm from the Dalton School. I wanted to, Khaled yesterday spoke so beautifully about technology and Benjamin and this idea of sort of the gods leaving and the technology remaining. I had this question, I had kind of a nest of them, and answer whatever you think is the most interesting to answer. Is there a way of imagining the singularity as a way of trying to summon the gods back? And is there, in keeping perhaps with Uday in the previous discussion, is there a role of poetry in this kind of like secular spirituality or non-tribalistic spirituality? Is there a relationship between poetry and this technology? You were kind of getting at that just now, but I'd be curious, and like, what is the relationship of poetry in this kind of strange, I mean, in many ways spiritualistic and religious, maybe tribalistic, I don't know, process?
I think you're really asking, well, that's not fair of me to say that. What I take from this nest of questions is a fundamental question about spirit and where and if it is to be found some way. Or maybe even what is it, right? So maybe the singularity is going to lead us to the gods, but I think maybe Kurzweil believes that because this thing he drew seemed to be going directly to heaven. I thought it was basically going directly to hell. But the notion of the spirit is so complicated because it sits as a kind of third term between the Cartesian mind-body, and then there's this thing called spirit, which doesn't have a home, right? It's sort of homeless, which is part of, I think, what you're asking. So where is the home for the spirit? And I think it's a question that I can't possibly answer, except for that I do think James is right about attention, and that one of the ways towards spirit, if we want to call it that, is by paying a certain kind of attention and not being distracted. And the attention can be in any kind, in many, I happen to love to pay attention to language, but my love of language is not a kind of disembodied love. It's actually very embodied in my love of the world. So they're related to each other. The love of the world, that is to say, the actual tactile, physical worldness of the world, and the strange, peculiar, non-materiality of language. And the relation between those two things has a kind of spiritual cadence or ratio, something in the the terms of the materiality of the world and the immateriality of language and their need for each other or their attraction to each other, it gives me a kind of feeling of spirit. But it's, that's not, I can't give that to you. So and that's the bigger question, is where could it be housed? And that goes to the talk before about tribalism. It's like in a tribe you can have, there's a house for the spirit. You can go and become part of that house. But I've never been part of any structure, any tribal structure for spirit, except for Bard College.
I would just briefly add, it's a really insightful question, and one thing I want to add is that I think it's worth looking at why people believe that the singularity could lead to some kind of transcendence or a spiritual higher plane, because people do believe that. I mean, that's part of the whole discourse right now around artificial intelligence. It's religious in a way, and what I think is valuable is to look at why, what is missing that makes people want to believe that version. Why do they want to believe the narrative of transcendence that is demoting the human in the process? I don't have a good answer to that question, but I would like an answer to that question, because maybe then we could, tell them that there's another path.
You have an answer? Can we get a microphone for a final answer, and then we're going to wrap up and release you to wine and cheese.
I'm being playful because you guys have already given me the answer, and it's channeling our 5-year-old curiosity. And you've said it in all your talks, and I want it to be center stage, which is, I'm going to tell you a story about a 3-year-old very quickly because I know we have to end. A 3-year-old, I learned this another day, asked her uncle, is what goes on in your brain the same as what goes on in my brain? And he says, what do you mean? This is 3 years old. And she said, do the thoughts that go on in my brain are the same thoughts in your brain? Meaning, you get what I'm saying? We're born naturally curious and brilliant to actually do theory of mind, all the cognitive stuff, fancy stuff, the feelings. We're born that way. And we grow up in a culture that does not value our curiosity. And so, Zoe, you answered your own question. You did provide solutions, and so did you, Anne. When you said, this is what I learned from you, Zoe, context affects content, and context can be captured through curiosity, the who, what, when. And that's the 5-year-old curiosity. And Anne, how do you bring back the humanities? Through curiosity, nurturing our natural curiosity that AI does not have, our sense of wonder at who we are and who you are, and what I can learn about me through you. That is what makes us human. And to me, I want curiosity to be a constant conversation in creativity, in technology, whatever we're talking, I want to remember that 3-year-old. Isn't that mind-blowing, that question? What goes on in your brain? Is it the same thing that goes on in my brain at 3 years old with that intelligent?
Well, there's also just, finally, that the issue of doubt, there are 2 ways you can think about doubt. You can have doubt as something that makes you fearful because you're in doubt. Yeah. And the other thing, that you're in doubt and you're curious. You become curious. And the cure for doubt is endless curiosity.
Endless curiosity.
Right.
And also, I have to remind you, Allison, you said to me at lunch that your joy is through curiosity. Right?
That's absolutely true.
Yeah.
Let's restore curiosity to our classrooms and to the world.
Yeah, there we go.
And let's drink to it. Thank you very much.